My scholar boy and ultimate concern. All right, so this is what we're going to do. And the assumption was, I guess, that I would take some affirmative or negative position with respect to God's existence, which I want to do. Part of the assumption was that the audience or the conversation partners were going to be, for the most part, if not entirely, Christian. And so it becomes something of an arrogance or hubris to assume that I could have a conversation with you in such a way that we would go back and forth about whether or not I could argue against the existence of God, which makes no sense at all. But what I would like to do is focus on how you should not talk about God. And so we're going to take a different position. So your participation comes in by way of articulating what you believe to be legitimate or justified ways of talking about God, and we should have an open dialogue about it, because many of you, Kenny, I guess, you the only one going to school next year?
Stephen, who's out here?
Oh, okay, well, for Kenny's purposes, I want Kenny to be ready because he's representing us. He will join the fraternity of Morehouse graduates, and literally, as poorly or how well we're sure Kenny will do, is going to be representative of you, and then Matthew will be going after that. So we want to have a conversation about what one should not say. And the reason why it should not, instead of what you won't say, is because it is normative. And that is, I believe it's better to talk certain ways. Certain ways receive precedent. Some ways, I think, are better, more practical than others. So there's no necessary relationship of what I have to say and what you want to say. It's merely normal. But a word of warning we're going to take from Willard Van Orman Quine. There's an essay that he wrote, 1950s, around 53, I believe, on what there is. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of it to understand the difficulty of having a conversation about the quality of being referred to as God. A curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? It can be answered, moreover, in a word: everything. And everyone will accept this answer as true. However, this is merely to say that there is what there is. There remains room for disagreement over cases, and so the issue has stayed alive down the centuries. Suppose now that 2 philosophers, Mac X and I, differ over ontologies. Suppose Mac X maintains there is something which I maintain there is not. Mac X can, quite consistently with his own point of view, describe our difference of opinion by saying that I refuse to recognize certain entities. I should protest, of course, that he is wrong in his formulation of our disagreement, for I maintain that there are no entities of the kind which he alleges for me to recognize. But my finding him wrong is in his formulation of our disagreement is unimportant, for I am committed to considering him wrong in his ontology anyway. When I try to formulate our difference of opinion, on the other hand, I seem to be in a predicament. I cannot admit that there are some things which Mac X countenances and I do not. For in admitting that there are such things, I should be contradicting my own rejection of them. It would appear, if this reasoning were sound, that in any ontological dispute, the proponent of the negative side suffers the disadvantage of not being able to admit that his opponent disagrees with him. This is the old Platonic riddle of non-being. Non-being must in some sense be, otherwise, what is it that there is not? This tangled doctrine might be nicknamed Plato's beard. Historically, it has proved tough, frequently dulling the edge of Occam's razor. How appropriate. So you should be able to see clearly now the implications for having a dialogue about the existence of God. Now, for some of you who might not know, ontology is pretty much the study of what there is, right? And metaphysics is understood as the study of the nature and the structure and the status of whatever we claim there is. Example, if we claim that there are molecules, right? Once we accept these entities, now we require what? a description of them. How do they operate? What types of characteristics they might exemplify? How do they obtain in the world? What Brother Quine here does, and Willard Van Orman Quine was probably one of the two most famous European Western philosophers after World War II. Very interesting fellow, an atheist, unabashedly so. And that might be giving him a little strong, he probably was something much farther than that alone, than just being an atheist. But be that as it may, the difficulty of articulating a belief in the presence of someone who does not share the belief is the difficulty we want to broach today. It is very, very difficult, as you understand. Now, one quote that I wanted to just repeat again is this. When I try to formulate our differences, and for our conversation, the differences in this case would be one assertion, there is God or a God, and the counter position, the negative of that statement, right? Is that okay so far? So, when I try to formulate our difference of opinion, on the other hand, I seem to be in a predicament. I cannot admit that there are some things which make X countenances and I do not. For in admitting that there are such things, I should be contradicting my own rejection of them. What does that mean? When you're in conversation or dialogue, there is a God. For someone to respond, there is not a God, they have already put themselves in a predicament. Because then they are asserting there is not something that they've already admitted of being. So for me to say there is not God, God already has existence by virtue of positing the very concept itself. Got that? So what Quine is trying to show you that the person who takes the negative side finds themselves in a predicament. Because how do you claim that there is not a thing that you just admitted there was? God. Is that confusing? Okay. Who says yes? Okay. If I were to say, I believe in Matthew, or believe that there is a Matthew, and I'll get to that, remind me, in and that, right? There is a Matthew. For me to say there is no such thing as Matthew, what am I saying there's no such thing? I'm implying the existence of a something. Even if it's vague, it still represents existence. So Quine is trying to represent, how do you have a conversation with somebody when you disagree, and what does he call it? I'll read this last bit to you. He said, it would appear, if this reasoning was sound, that in any ontological dispute, the proponent of the negative side suffers the disadvantage of not being able to admit that his opponent disagrees with him. This is the old Platonic riddle of non-being. Non-being must in some sense be. Otherwise, what is it that there is not? This tangled doctrine might be nicknamed Plato's deism. Historically, it has proved tough, frequently dulling the edge of Occam's razor. And everybody knows Occam's razor, right? No. When you have two competing theories to explain one phenomenon or event, the simplest one is the best one you can choose, right? In this case, it's just dulled that very idea, because we would have assumed earlier, if I say that there's a Matthew, the counterposition is there is no such thing as Matthew. But then that doesn't make any sense. We philosophically refer to that as incoherent, right? Because it doesn't make any sense for me to say there is no thing Matthew. And then the question is, what is there not Matthew? So you find yourself in a quandary. So my point here is to avoid having a conversation about the existence of God and push us towards not saying certain things. Right? Another assumption, that the believer has somehow found his nemesis when they assert a belief in a particular doctrine or dogma. So again, let's use Matthew again. If Matthew would assert he believes in the Last Supper. For me to say that I do not believe in the Last Supper does not imply that we contradict one another at all. What Matthew would want to say in this occasion would be that he and I have different conceptual frameworks, one of which does not allow for the possibility of such a conceptual structure, and the other one does. So what I want you to understand is that don't assume that the believer and the person who claims the opposite of your belief are contradicting one another. Right? And I'll show you how that works out in moral reasoning as well. It shows up in something, oh, it's in class with me. Oh. I won't ask them. You know, moral perspective that
No, I'm
consistent with?
asking a question on the subject.
What is that?
I don't get the part about the one who makes the notion that there is not a God, how does that one win? Well,
that's the point. Don't have that conversation is what I'm trying to push. This is the conversation that we have on a very pedestrian level. There's a tendency to assume that the believer assertion there is a God, and the assumption is that the counterposition is there is no God.
so
Are conflicting. They don't conflict. The person who claims there is no God has already implied the existence of God
Okay,
in the very so-called negation. You're not negating it.
so it's not an argument.
No.
Okay.
Not one that the person who does not hold the same ontological view. So Quine would refer to something like this. He would call this, your universe is overpopulated. Remember that guy? It's overpopulated. And it's just a metaphorical way of referring to the fact that you have too many entities that inhabit your ontological being world, right? There's too much stuff in it. And so the issue here is, how do you have a conversation with somebody who does not admit of the same amount of stuff that you do? And some of the things that you might admit of, angels, heaven, God. And so the difficulty for the non-believer is, how do they have a conversation with you as a believer? What I'm trying to encourage now is for you all as believers to think critically about the types of conversations you engage in and be very careful not to fall victim to some of the structures. Yes, sir.
So what is the definition, an appropriate definition of atheism?
Appropriate definition? Someone whose conceptual framework does not include the same entities your ontological structure does. That is English. And what did I just avoid saying?
God.
There is no God, right? Because I'm telling you, it's a bad situation to put yourself in, to say there is no God. And the point is, it's not an assertion, as it's not the same as saying there is a God, but the difficulty is you have to work towards undermining the very presence of this dubious concept. So even if we take out God, because that seems to be problematic for people, right? You just replace it with a variable X, right? Or as we say in philosophy language, with an open sentence. And so anything that satisfies for the characteristics you associate with God would satisfy for X, right? So, yeah.
Well, one thing that's confusing me for something like that, it seems that somebody could recognize, what someone thinks is a conception of God without recognizing that there is a God. For instance, I don't believe that there is a Santa Claus. You know what I mean when I say I do believe in Santa Claus.
But that's where we would fall victim. That's where we get in trouble, though. For you to assume or even hope that I will grant you. You debate it. I'm not going to grant you what the most positive outcome could be. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
No. So you couldn't say, you know what I mean. No, I'm going to say, no, I don't.
Well, that's what somebody on the God side would say.
Well,
There is no God. So if I'm going to credit, all right, I believe in Santa Claus. Guy, white beard, red hat, has reindeer. Okay, fine. Yeah, I still don't believe in that.
But
So
you've
then-
already, the difficulty is,
You're agreeing that there is some sort of concept.
it has something to do with the predicate-subject relationship has not been disconnected in such a way that it has disavowed the possibility of that conversation in the first place. So say for instance, when did you stop beating your wife? This is in philosophy, a logical, complex question. To answer it implies truthfulness.
Mhm.
It's a similar situation, right? Anything you say is an illegitimate proposal, right? That's my point about the believer and non-believer in this regard. For you to say there is a God, for me to respond by there is no God, I've already given legitimacy to even the issue.
Or given legitimacy to the concept itself.
But I'm saying, but what Quine I'm trying to represent here, I don't know what that means. I mean, what does that mean? It would be equivalent for him to say, and in the philosophical tradition early in the 20th century, and I don't want to go through too much of this, there was a group of philosophers who believed that something called the verification principle, in order for a sentence versus a particular thing in the world, they believed that the best way to have a conversation was to analyze the structure of sentences as to whether or not they were coherent or not. right? And their coherency was commensurate with their correspondence to material reality. So about anything I say must somehow bear out in the world. So when you didn't do that in moral claims, aesthetic claims, and what they call mystical claims, and religious claims, the difficulty was there's nothing in the world which would satisfy the verification principle. How do we verify the truthfulness or falsity of any claim of religion, ethics, or the mystical? There is no way, right? For them. This is a similar situation here. If you want to somehow argue that
there is no way for whom? There is no way to verify this claim for whom you said for
aesthetics, ethics, and the mystical.
Okay, but you said there's no way for them. Who are you calling?
Oh, these people are called logical positivists. I'm sorry. They were called logical positivists. Right? So the point is, statements that include a concept, as you said, God, they were referred to as Unsinn in German, the nonsense. It has no sense to it at all. Now, what they mean by sense, is there anything in the world by virtue of which your sentence that includes that concept would be true? What would make it true? If I say God is all powerful, they're going to take that to be equivalent to me doing this. Same response. How would you respond to what I just did? That's what they would say about the concept of God. They would say, huh? Now, they're antagonistic towards the religious, we know this. And so Wittgenstein, which I want to introduce a little later, comes in and tries to give room to the possibility of making religious articulations. And Wittgenstein is the person I referred to earlier when I said, if you were to say you believe in the Last Supper and I say I don't, Wittgenstein wanted to argue you all are in disagreement. You have different conceptual frameworks, one of which allows for the belief in the Last Supper, the other one doesn't. Y'all don't disagree. Yes, Kyle.
Because of how showed up in the world, how it is his own context. That context of both the atheist and the theist. Those are concepts they get perceived.
Oh, you saying the social context? That's much the social context.
How they see the world.
Now that's the problem because it's too much background information. Well, the short of it is this. The position, and again, remember what my aim is, right?
Yeah.
Is to assist you in not having certain types of conversations, right? Because we're trying to seek things such as understanding. So we get understanding through certain forms of explanation. But if you engage with someone who is already antagonistic towards your worldview, if you will, that's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
The difficulty is the best description we have of reality is normally given to us by the sciences. Okay? So the best description we have of reality, sciences. Now, when things are descriptions outside of that, you have to ask more of somebody's epistemic structures, right? You're asking me to allow or expand my universe to include the types of things you would like for me to include. But again, that's a matter of belief, faith, taste, choice. And we can even talk about choice as being a scientific term as well. But we'll just leave that to the side.
So I guess a good analogy is I had somebody from, first century or before first century.
Africa or Europe? You just speak Europe on your life. It's okay. Go ahead.
And talking about concept, and if I tell them that I think the earth is round.
Okay.
And they want me
Now, okay, good. No, we're back to the subject-predicate relationship. The issue is not with the subject, it's with the predications of whatever the subject is. So the closest we can get here is, if I don't have the concept roundness, well, how would I respond to you? I couldn't. But we're talking about the subject in this regard. So don't say the earth is round, and my response is the earth is round. What if I said there are SIBOs, and they are perfect. I'm just trying to show you the difficulty in trying to engage in the conversation when someone doesn't accept or admit of the same entities you do. Now, part of the difficulty, now watch this. The strain is this. Aristotle, you all know, represents this. Immanuel Kant represents it almost 1,000 years later. Human beings, by very nature, desire to know. Your desire to know is somehow not enough to claim you will know and that you do know. Even though we operate on the principle of sufficient reason, which claims that we will know eventually, but that's about material reality, not about non-material reality. So the principle of sufficient reason only claims that we can't have an answer for everything eventually, even if I don't know the answer. So my ignorance cannot be cause for claiming it not to exist, which falls victim oftentimes to a fallacy of what? The inability to prove is not disproved, and vice versa, right? Which happens again in religious discourse. There's a discourse about whether or not God exists. The believer comes in, God exists. And then the non-believer, the assumption is, no, God doesn't exist. Then the believer says, show me or prove to me God doesn't exist. The non-believer says, I can't, or they fail to adequately give a description that you accept. Then your response commits a fallacy. See, I told you couldn't disprove God existed. That's a fallacy. Right? The inability to prove does not disprove, does not prove, and prove, the inability to prove does not disprove. You can't do that. Either way you go. But there's a tendency to assume this. Now, what's the practicality of having a conversation with somebody who doesn't believe what you believe? In this regard, that there is something X that you want to call God. Look at this. This X is understood to be perfect, all good, all knowing. Now, let's talk about the problems here. The problem is how heavily anthropomorphized these concepts are. So what I'm going to push for is something called an apophatic or negative position. And that is, we should move towards removing predications of God, right, to represent a closeness or relationship with God. This is done by Plotinus. I don't know if many of you all are familiar, who was non-Christian but heavily influenced by Plato as well. But the point here being, it's better to be in a position where you accept the inability to articulate, which is later going to count on which famous theologian? Aquinas. Because Aquinas' assumption was what? But what do? But you not only what is not, but you do it through a literary device called an analogy. Right? So you use that because the hubris or the arrogance has to do with what? Assuming that your articulation captures what God is essentially. Now, once that happens, what happens? What's the result of assuming that your assertions about God captures God's essence? What's a possible result?
Then it becomes absolute.
Absolute, and you control God.
That's idolatry.
It's an idolatry, yes. Right? Now, read from Job. This is what's interesting. So I know y'all like reading from the text and so forth. So, right there, 38, verse 2. Or y'all call 38 and 2. Fair. It was already on 38 and 2, wasn't it? Right here. When's it up? Is it 38 and 2? It's right down the left. Oh, 2.
That was lost.
Read.
Go ahead.
Read.
Who is this that darkens counsel?
Y'all need to listen to
Counsel by
this.
words without knowledge. I'll read it again. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now by thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors, and to break forth as if it were, or as if it had issued out of the womb? when I made the cloud, the garment thereof, and thick darkness, and swallowing band for it, and break up for it my declared place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but further, and here shall thou proud ways be stayed.
Now, what's going on here?
God's giving Job a tongue lashing.
I can hear.
I said God's giving Job a tongue lashing.
Okay, but we right on. It represents this fundamental tradition of humanity's lack of knowledge, inability to accurately capture through assertions anything about God of significance. Now, there are multiple ways of reading this. D.C. Phillips was a philosopher of religion, very good within what's called the Wittgensteinian tradition. It's interesting that when he writes about this, there are multiple ways to read this. One way to read this is whether or not we interpret this under the same categories that we understand human understanding, reasoning, and knowledge. And what I mean by that is, do we now interpret that text or that reading in the same way I would a human's inability to know or to understand? See, this is the difficulty, because the same assertion, human knowing is not going to be equivalent to God's knowing. The problem is when we take this to be similar to the way we come to know. Because in order to make the assertion, it would have to be. You understand that? In order for me to make a claim about my inability to know, I would have to have access to what knowing is. Right? And then for me to ascribe that to God and say God's ways are not our ways, you all love to do that when you all think that somebody is telling you something. Right? I'm not talking about you particularly, it's sort of disposition of a believer. If somebody makes a statement, you'll say, well, our ways are not God's ways. God's ways are not our ways. It's different. You're trying to dislocate, you're trying to undermine the very ability to assert anything affirmative about God. But the very statement itself is an affirmation of knowledge of God and what God can and can't do. So you are self-refuting. Right? Does that make sense? You understand how that's self-refuting?
Yeah.
For me to say that our ways are not God's ways, right? And the implication is God knows, you don't know. So, segue to my next issue, theodicy. Right? The difficulty in theodicies or theodicists, which people who purport to somehow give an account, they have to know. They've already taken a position of knowing. And the assumption, which I think is even the worst, the most egregious assumption, is that they're supposed to know.
In order to do what they have to know?
To maintain the position of theodicy in the first place. Oh, I'm sorry, theodicy. One of your chapel sisters explained to people who don't know. What's theodicy?
If God is all good, how can he lie?
They can't hear you back there.
If God is all good, how can he lie even in the world?
And the assumption also is undeserved suffering. That creates another issue, right? Undeserved. Because there is no, well, the closest we get to a counter concept is what?
Oh, theodicy?
The counter of theodicy is what? Grace. Right. That's the closest you get.
Well,
when I was in elementary school, they used to say, what is grace? A free gift from God. Right? Because the issue is this. Why do good things happen to people undeservedly?
Well, so what? I guess my question is, what then do you do with notions of soul?
Playing out at the pond, where they're shaping all the words of the stage, we're merely actors. Entrances and exits. No, you don't want that. You want to say, I don't want to go in, I don't choose to go in. I want to make my own way in the world. Yes, sir.
So God, traditionally, in our world, if God can only be good, then does that mean God is not free?
And that creates a problem too. Now, what do you believe the response to your question would be?
Logically, no.
Do you all understand his question? Restate it, please.
Well, you spoke about freedom, saying that if you can be good, then that.
In order for us to be free, both have to be a possibility.
Right.
Because freedom implies those possibilities.
Right. And I mentioned that in our world, people like to believe that because they're comfortable with it, that God can only be good. And if that's true, then does that mean that God is not free if he can't be bad?
So now we got a good lead segue into myth making. And so the myths of peoples around the world always includes what? Positive, negative energy. So the negative energy for within the Christian world is what? Satan, Beelzebub, the devil. Right? Now, let's push it even further. I'm trying to show you how you get in trouble with certain type of conversation. The very notion of the opposite of whatever God is a necessary condition for God's existence.
As all good.
If your claim is God is good, perfectly so, there must be something to counter that. But then the so-called universe is determined. Right? You understand that? The notion of goodness cannot exist without its opposite. I mean, what would God would just be? It wouldn't be good God. It would just be. It would be like this bag. This is neither good nor bad. It just is.
So you're saying that it's a necessary and sufficient condition, even with a necessary condition for good.
Yeah, it has been.
Right. So I'm saying, Donald, you understand that? That's what he's saying. Right. One's existence necessitates the other.
What's the opposite of up? I thought you were going to say middle, but yeah. No, so we'll just take those extremes. My point is, we have cardinal directions because they're relative. I mean, we live on a sphere. How do you go east on a sphere? There's a point of departure. Wherever I am, that's what east, west, north, and south become. Right? For me to say the world is not the way I believe it should be, and is out of order, and that sin is into, what's the opposite of that? So I'm playing a little bit with what Leibniz calls possible worlds. And so you have to think logically about the possibility of these other types of things existing simultaneously. You understand that? So there is a world you have to think about intellectually where you're not sitting here, or that you have your hand on your face. These are all logical possibilities, right? And what Leibniz referred to as a necessary qualification is whatever is necessary on all possible scenarios is necessary. Universally so, right? So we're just talking about things like up, down. Those are universals, right? Because it's always going to be, if you're somewhere, that becomes up. Yes, sir.
The theologian C.S. Lewis, he describes God as horrific. Can you give me your analysis?
I'll go back 200 years before that. Blaise Pascal, one of my favorite philosophers. Compare him to Nicholas Cusa and Giordano Bruno, right? There are many ways to understand God, but Giordano Bruno and Nicholas Cusa had a tendency to look at the awesomeness, the lack of knowledge, this negative, this apophatic disposition I'm referring to. They looked at the awesomeness of God through their lack of knowledge. So the less they knew. There's a text, it's Bruno's Learned Ignorance, which you all read when you go to seminary. Learned Ignorance, or Learned Ignorance. Beautiful book. And the idea here is that their position was, the less I know, the greater God is. And I would be arrogant to assume that I had knowledge that God had. Well, Blaise Pascal comes back, never Nicholas Cusa, Blaise Pascal is horrified by the lack of knowledge. He's absolutely undone by it, petrified by the awesomeness of God. You understand this? That he's thrown off kilter by the very structure of ignorance. So when things happen, he is undone. Now, all of these are human dispositions towards our knowing, right? These are all dispositions toward our ignorance. And remember, I began by saying, referring to people like Aristotle and Immanuel Kant, human beings by our very natures desire to know. So that inclination, if that's true, the difficulty often arises by virtue of not being able to articulate the reality. So let's put it in contemporary parlance. When events transpire that we define as bad, evil, there's a tendency on our part to wish to explain the chaotic possibilities in such a way that we can control them. Right? We look for order. There's another book by David Tracy from the University of Chicago, Blessed Rage for Order. You know where that poem is from?
Could you say the name of that book?
Blessed Rage for Order.
Blessed Rage for Order?
That's out of the poem by Wallace Stevens. But the beautiful thing is this, though. Human beings want this order. When you don't have it, you become petrified. You're scared. Somebody your age dies, what do you say? How? Then somebody says, they just dropped dead. But what was wrong with them? Do you see the inclination? Why do you want to know?
Make sure it can't happen.
Exactly. The assumption is you're trying to do your little checklist. I don't have that. I didn't smoke. I didn't drink. They didn't either. Did they have some precondition? They had no precondition. It starts to get scary. This is the point of Job as well. Right? Job is going over the Hebrew tradition of what precipitates this type of behavior from God. And he did a checklist. I didn't do that. I didn't do that. I didn't do that. I did this, this, and this. And why did it happen? I'm trying to encourage you to move away from that disposition. And I'm not going to take it to the end here, but that's what I'm trying to move us away from. The position that humans should take is one of the acceptance of unknowing, as difficult as it may sound. A lack of understanding is a better position to be in. And who's our most famous Western person for articulating this? Socrates. What is the definition of knowledge? To know that you don't know. Come on now. To know that you don't know. Now, that's a difficult situation for human beings. Again, if human beings by our very nature desire to know and then you can't, that creates a conflict. Anxiety. And now I have to blacken it. We do have a right to ask God, and God owes us an explanation. Don't confuse our inability to know with a lack of right to ask. And guess what? One philosopher will argue is not that we may ultimately never know, it's not time. Yes, ma'am.
So if you have to have the opposite of something to, I guess, make it whole, so like up and down, big, small. If we say God is good, and then his counterpart will be Satan, is Satan God made, or is Satan just is because you believe that God is?
Well, see, you just did it. See,
and I don't even understand that.
No, my point was, it's our own making. What do you want? Now, what you want conflicts with reality, but at least you know what you want, though, right?
Yes, because if I say God made Satan, but that would imply that God can do that.
And what I'm leading to is this. When we have beliefs, when we have a certain faith position, we must initiate the condition by seeking practical ends. So I will have faith only to the degree to which I seek a certain end in life, whether or not it's caring, loving, sharing. I am going to construct my faith position based on those virtues. Now, what changes those for me, or refines them, or cultivates them, is when my desire meets the world. Right? So I have a desire for freedom and justice and fairness. The world's going to tell me how much, if at all possible. I'm just trying to move us towards the types of activities we can engage in on the human level, and let that higher pollutant conversation go by the wayside. That's why I don't like theology. I'm not interested. And I'm trying to move towards learning ignorance. I don't know. I'd rather focus on the things I can do and maximize that, because I can't change God. Logically, I wouldn't want to. I would not think that when I cry, God cries, but God should cry. But that has more to do with my not wanting God to be so much like me that God might not like me some days, like I don't like certain people. See, that's the problem with anthropomorphizing God. People want to take it to a certain, but they don't want to go all the way, right? So God, if God is like us, some days God doesn't like you. And then ontologically that becomes a problem because not just that, because think about Aristotle's definition of God, right? Thought thinking itself. And the belief there is God does not think all entities, they won't exist. If we take that and understand God not liking me, I'd probably drop dead. If I believe God is sustainer, ground of being, and so forth. And we also got to talk about what these terms mean, whether or not they're taken literally, imaginatively. I think they have different values. And for black folk, they have a very different interpretation as well. Somebody was at their hand. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
So what
Wonderful. Now we move into my position about how you develop. You should have a faith expectation. You should have a theological expectation as well. That's with black folk. That takes us straight to the black people, right? Black people had to say what? James Cone's response was, God must appear to be this way. That's the same thing, right? God must be like this, otherwise I don't want it. Exactly. So for me to have a conversation with somebody, to have that kind of conversation, what would my concept have to be like in order for me to accept it, good or bad?
So you would actually be arguing that your particular context necessitates your relationship?
Necessitates pretty strong, but I don't care. We can work on that later. Requires, which is a part of necessitated. And this is what we call them a lot. These are moral terms, right? The idea that God must necessarily be a certain way in order for you to accept God. And that's good or bad. The issue isn't whether or not it meets your purposes and desires. The issue is whether or not that God conceptually is going to be strong enough through time.
That's not changing God. That's a drive.
Well, that's what y'all read, and y'all accept that one. No, it does change because our conditions change. Yeah. So if you look at everything from Al Rabbito's slave religion, about the first chapter is on the gods of Africa, and you move through, they're constantly being cultivated and refined. But if you're cultivating and refining them, you're implying what? This has less to do with God and more to do with my desires to be a certain type of human being.
So does that imply that the attempts to keep God the same, to claim that God is not changing, is...
That's incoherent. That's the response. That's incoherent. And then, what would be the resource to inform us of that God is unchanging? And if you can't, I'm legitimately asking, what would be the resource that would inform me God has not changed since the time before I knew God?
It has to be reducible to one's experience, and then that's in a constant state of flux as well.
So things in the world are normally contingent, right? So my experiences are contingent, and the only thing the Christian is going to claim is necessary are these attributes of God, omni, 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 omni. And see, part of what you all, I thought some of y'all would jump on it earlier. This is absolutely a creation of my own machinations.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But people are afraid to do this. People believe we have a religious gene, depending on who you talk to. People believe that we've imbibed God from culture. Again, looking at the history of black folk in this country, and other countries, but in this country particularly, all that's fine. That's never been a problem. To admit of this sort of self-created concept. Right? When you're enslaved, you fundamentally don't have time to do theology. You can only be about personal relationship with God. Mm-hmm. Right? And that changed consistently. From the time of men and women being raped by their owners, God had to be something very different. Because the next day, what would allow me reasonably to say God exists. If the concept of God's perfect goodness is going to be allowed. Now, goodness got to be redefined. I mean, all these things have to be reformulated.
Who really can do theology? Because we're not all enslaved, but we all are still in need of some.
I don't know who will, I know who can't do theology in a traditional way, I'll say. Children who've been raped, women who've been raped and beaten, men who fight against fake notions of masculinity on a daily basis. I mean, how do you do it?
But even
So we're
then,
really talking about having a conversation with those people.
Well, you could,
Because they can't have the same ontological.
but because both, I'm assuming, claim to have a belief, becomes the minimal requirement for the conversation. If I don't have a belief, you and I can't talk about that. There's no conversation to have. If I love him and you don't, what's the conversation when you and I are about to have about him?
This goes back to the notion of the whole suffering. And what is suffering? How can you articulate it being earned or not? And then going further to this notion of unearned suffering being redemptive.
Yep.
And whether or not that's even a category worthy of consideration for the notion of suffering.
Yeah. And do I believe in redemptive suffering? No. Now, this is the thing, though. The students confuse this. I don't believe one must suffer in order to know or love. But when you suffer, you can learn to love.
Yes. Yes.
But they conflate those under the assumption I must suffer in order to get better. No. No. But I can learn from my suffering.
Suffering isn't an
So my point is, sometimes suffering is absolutely banal, without meaning. It's just suffering. Unadulterated, inarticulate suffering.
And like everything else, it's really up to you.
And to the person or to whom I impute my suffering.
Really?
Oh, yes. See, they don't get off.
They could. They're living their life.
No, they can't. They live with me. That's the master-slave dialectic. You cannot live without me, master. You cannot. You can't be who you are without me.
Can you explain that?
master wouldn't be master without.
Okay, so that changes who they are.
well, hey, I want to go back to the point that you said that certain people can't do theology in as much as.
Oh, I said I know who couldn't. I was talking about in the way that we were referring to them.
Okay. Because I'm asking how then do you distinguish between what is operative and theoretical as it pertains to theology? So just because it's not theoretical doesn't mean that theology can't be reduced.
But that's why I referred to what black folk did, right?
Right.
They lived.
Yeah.
Theology requires dogma, structures. That's what I'm referring to, formal theological structures, right? Salvation, grace, what is the role of Christ in the life of the... They lived, and then those become the definitions they operate from. So they will say, when master raped me and I turned and I looked to God and then, bam, that's theology, that's fine. You understand that? So when I went through it, what happens after that becomes theology.
Yeah, right.
It started as anthropology.
Which is exactly. Do you understand the difference though? Yeah. So, but then in the Western world, theology normally is, and this is what a traditionalist sort of conservative religious disposition is. Something happens to Kenny. Where's the Bible? I got to find out how to. You see my point? What are you supposed to do when? No, that ain't gonna work right now. That part ain't in there yet. Right? That's Revelation 2. So my point is, and people when they do African American religious experiences, when they talk about this, they have a tendency not to understand the immediacy of our relationship with God over time. It's immediate. It is not bad that it wasn't reflective. It was immediate. It's like having a child. When your child suffers, you don't, well, hold on, let me talk to you about this. Sit down. No. You address it immediately. You hug, you kiss, you nurture, you cherish. And then we talk about what those things now mean in light of my hugging and loving and kissing.
It's also constructive and creative.
Yes. But I'm not going to sit there and say, well, the reason why you fell and scratched your legs so terribly, that's what, there's a tendency for theology to be done that way. When you're talking to me about it, live, do it, perform the acts, right? That's very different. And I don't think, and so guess what? Now when someone asks you, how does a Christian respond to suffering? It's descriptive. Right? You don't create some universal prescription of how to deal with suffering. Because it's decontextualized suffering. It's absolutely decontextualized, which is the problem with dogma, with theological dogma. The assumption is that we can set up these general structures like laws are structured. And so if you have a problem, go and look at the statute and see how best to respond. So I grew up in an environment where they thought they could tell us how to respond, right? What to eat, what not to do. When you're in this situation, this is what you should do. But then, what does the Bible say about crack? Well, then they get real creative. Right? Don't know you not that your body is the temple of... Really? That's the response to crack? Wow. It becomes empty because you never dealt with the issue of why I needed crack. So if it ain't crack, it's going to be something else. Right? And then we come up with these general, and I'm not trying to undermine your resources. I'm asking you, if you're going to use them, you got to be very clear about what you are asserting about what you think you believe. That's what that's the cautionary tale I wish to provide. Be very, very careful about what you think you're saying and what you're actually saying. Right? So if I say God is all good, what am I saying? Because all these other issues are prevalent. When you suffer, think about this. If you go back and read St. Augustine, whom you should read regularly, he went through the same issue. When he was a Manichaean for a while, the idea that you had these opposite, good, evil, but then God can't be in control. If you have equal good and equal evil, you don't have God in control the way that you would like to assert. You got to come up with another ontological structure. Remember I talked about it before? You got to come up with another metaphysics of reality in such a way that you got to make room. So just as God is good, there has to be an equal to offset. Now, if God is greater than evil, what's the result of that? More importantly, God is allowing the evil to be evil with you. Exactly. So, the humble position is for the human being to say, I know less than I assumed I did, that my result of my engagement with God is not one of understanding. Now, again, that's very difficult. Like I told you before, we all want sociological, psychological expressions of human activity. We all want to know, somebody got shot, what happened? Because you see yourself as a potential victim of violence. And you want to know whether or not you can engage in certain activities that will preclude your experience being the same. Yes.
What we can't say about God.
What I'm suggesting we shouldn't say. Remember I said I'm making it normative.
Yeah. What we shouldn't say about God. So when we were talking about allowing for if God is for something to be free, that allow it to do good and evil. What this is a kind of line we don't deal with the testing idea and how to create evil. Right? So in that kind of we think that
well, the issue, but what happens, Kyle? He was asking about the text in Isaiah, do we associate when God says God created evil?
Yeah.
And you wanted to somehow, is that reconcilable with God's goodness? Is that the issue?
Well, yeah, and how is that notion of God being evil really does that help the person?
to help the person who's suffering? Well, I'd probably have to text one of my Bible friends before I even engaged in that. So, and people know I normally don't engage in exegesis. Not because I don't know the context of the text. I don't know what the allusions are. I don't know what the purposes were. But let's do by hypothetical. I can see a way for that being asserted, even if we take it away from God. What would it mean to say I created evil? What would it mean to say that you're free in such a way that you came before and asked them to redeem evil? Is that possible? Yeah. So the idea of the creation of evil has to be simultaneous with the creation of goodness. Yeah. Right? So think about, some theologians were even talking about if you accept the original pair and the myth of Adam and Eve, you have to accept the presence. We go back to Leibniz again with possible worlds.
Yeah. Okay.
Every act they performed, the logical possibility of the opposite was always present.
Because
otherwise, they weren't free.
So the possibility of
freedom. That's my point. I'm asking you to read it as freedom.
All right.
But again, I don't do Bible. You ask Kenny,
I don't
know how to take that one, Kenny. Yeah, kind of like that. Yes, sir.
Oh, correct me if I'm mistaken. You said your favorite philosopher of religion was Kusa?
No. I said one of my favorites was Pascal.
Pascal.
Blaise Pascal. Now, my favorite Christian is Zoran Kierkegaard. That's my favorite Christian.
Could you use his perspective on this question I'm about to ask you? I want to move back to grace. Is grace available for a man such who killed 4 soldiers, well, not 4 soldiers, a certain amount of soldiers at Fort Hood?
I have no idea. But then I'd be doing theology then. That's what I'm saying. I am. See, what I'm trying to get y'all to do is move away from associating God with any of that kind of mess. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm moving toward. Okay. Stop that. Okay. Stop it. What would it mean for those people? What would it mean for that man to be free in such a way he decided to go and act the fool?
Because they don't ascribe to God.
But my thing is this theology.
So you want to use God outside of it?
No, I want to use God. What I say was I want to shut up, talk about God, do my duty, that is best, leaving to God the rest, right? That's the point. I can't make the determination. Yeah. And think about it this way. What hubris would I represent if I said, let me tell you, brother, this is exactly what I heard from the Lord, right? And then go through, and God said, wow. The assumption that God only talks to certain people.
Yep.
We got past this, we thought, with Luther and the rest of it.
Well, that is true. That God only talks to certain people.
Okay, that's okay. No, my point is that's my point. What I'm trying to get to? Okay.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
No, I mean, I can't. There's nothing we can argue. You understand?
Yeah, that's true.
What am I going to argue?
But even with that, how did you come to the?
The kid want to know more than I do.
I know for the purpose of conversation. How did you come to this place where you now posit that idea that God only speaks to a certain demographic of individuals and not others?
Well, I've seen it with my own eyes.
You've seen? Okay. No. And you know the problem you're about to have, though? No, seriously. And this be very, very careful.
No problem.
No, it does. Be very careful of what you take to be the evidentiary force of your claim of knowing. You're trying to support a non-verifiable concept with verifiable principles, right? So let's take God out of the equation and put love in, which something which seems to be a little closer to us than God. Conception. Right? So watch this. If we were to say, I know love because I've loved my mother and I've loved a romantic partner of sorts, right? What would I say in response to that? What could I say? Nothing. You could not put forth any evidence that would somehow persuade me, dissuade me. That belongs to you. That's the beauty of faith. It's yours.
Well, my question is around suffering. So I guess I'm gonna put it down like this. Is suffering available to this man that killed the innocent soldiers at Fort Hood? Is he condemned to suffering forever, and is grace available to him still?
Now the reason why, now I'll stop being flippant and do this, is going to be contingent upon your faith tradition. Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian. If there's any value, they try to provide you resources. I'll give that positive reading, right? So I don't know your notions of sanctification, justification. I don't know any of that. And the reason why I'm admitting this is for me to give you an answer might fall beyond the purview of what you accept to be the structure of reality. So if my notion of justification is different than yours, my notion of grace is different than yours, it appears that we conflict, but we don't. You just have a different tradition that informs you differently on these matters. So I step outside of those traditions and I try to give an account of human freedom, that the possibility, remember, and the same possibility you exercise every day of not killing, I'm saying this guy in Texas had the same option, all things considered, that he does not have some malady, some psychological malady that determined him to perform acts that he would not freely choose, right? So all I'm trying to do is you're gonna have to draw on, in that situation, I would say, think clearly about dissociating goodness from your interpretation. I'm referring to goodness as God. Taking that out of the equation and asking yourself, was this guy free in such a way that he decided to do this? Right? Yes, ma'am.
So, like, when you're talking about, like, freedom, oppression, and grace and all that, I remember in your class you had stated that, you know, the Christian's form of grace is oppressive because we say, you know, we have grace and even if you choose not to have it, the grace still follows.
Oh, prevenient grace is oppressive.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think, like, based upon his question, like, are you saying that grace is only accessible to people that feel the need to attain it?
No, I don't know what he means by it. So for me to give him an answer to his question, I would be presenting what I understand by it. And I'm telling him to draw on, if he wants to, he asked a question about grace. I don't know what he means by that. So I would have to say, and we don't have time and place right now, we would have to sit down and he's going to have to clarify to me what is tradition and what he takes to be grace, how it operates, how it functions, when you employ it, when you don't, what control God has over it. I don't know any of that. The problem with prevenient grace is what? The believer will tell the non-believer, you're covered by God anyway. I don't care if you accept God or not. Wow. That's why I call it oppressive. Because you literally undermine the integrity of another person's freedom to choose not to associate with the concept, and you go tell them they're covered anyway.
So doesn't that conflict with what you said about the notion of things being opposed to each other and just existing? So whether or not grace follows or doesn't follow, it just is. So it is to be. Like, doesn't that kind of conflict? Like, if he's saying the whole condemnation of, you know, he's condemned to suffering and grace is still accessible to him, wouldn't it be more so likely that it's not prevenient grace of saying, oh, whether you accept it or not, just saying because it is, it is?
Well, outside of the hegemony of it, his issue was, he asked me whether or not this gentleman in Texas was going to have grace. And I said, I can't answer. I have no idea. Because, like I said, that would require he and I to have a long conversation. What does he mean by this man? What? I don't know what he means.
It just seems that in you defining grace, that you have different compartments of grace that you choose.
I didn't define
it though.
I didn't define it.
What he's saying is you have to create a stipulated definition of grace before you can engage that dialogue, right?
I'm trying to avoid universalizing the term and imposing it on him. Because I could easily sit here and say, no. Then he's going to say, well, hold up, doesn't grace, which means he has a different understanding of grace. So I could have said my understanding of grace means this guy is going to hell for what he did to those people. He gets no grace from God. Which, depending on your religious tradition, that's supposed to be a fundamental difference between the Hebrew Bible and Christian Testament, right? That some Christian denominations believe that no longer will God impute God's punishment on the guilty, but now you have grace that now precludes that type of behavior on God's part, and you have the ability to live again and be forgiven. All you must ask for is forgiveness of your sins.
One sin abounded, no grace abounded.
That's right. So, but again, I don't know what tradition we're talking about. So, in general conversation, my issue is to ask him, how does he understand? And as Kenny referred to, a stipulated definition allows us to have a conversation. It does not admit of agreement. It just admits we have a point to talk about. A stipulated definition means I would have to ask him some basic understandings of what he means by grace.
But doesn't that take away from the role of the believer? Because like if the believer is supposed to talk to you about their belief, and if the goal of the Christian is to win souls for Christ, then
See, you
why
just
would
added something.
I don't know that. I wouldn't say that was.
Yeah, you just added me. So you just see how you just added that? I would say no, I'm not that kind. Right? I like Nietzsche. The only true Christian died on the cross. Right? So for me, everything else you all are doing, I don't know what that is normally.
Yeah, somebody's getting ratted out.
Yeah, so and I think there's a lot to be taken there, because what Nietzsche was trying to say is the person, and I think Peter Gomes in his text refers to a similar situation when he talks about the question is not what would Jesus do, the issue is what would you do?
Right.
And it's the same situation when you talk about that scenario. It's about what it's your choice. So when Nietzsche says there's a true Christian down on the cross, the issue is Jesus lived the life of Jesus. What are you doing? Right? I mean that's why I would say again, what I would not want to say something to him to create a conflict where he assumes it's a conflict, because whatever I say about the grace is not contradicting him, it's within a particular tradition. And without asking him the specifics of it, that's why again I said I could not answer your question because I don't know what you mean by the term. Now, hypothetically, you mean will this man be forgiven?
Is forgiveness available to this man?
And again, your answer would be no. Your answer would be
Because
no. What would your answer be?
Oh, forgiveness is available to this man.
Okay.
Now, that's a very important statement that you made. I think you should be aware. Another issue here. Let me put it in a form of a question. Is what happened at Fort Hood a problem for God?
Yeah.
Rather than dealing with that head on, from an angle. Remember the earlier point about God crying? Does God cry? What are the implications of God's crying? Or that there's a problem?
45 of that has still.
Are there any problems in God?
And what do I always tell students?
God is perfect.
And perfect is very scary here. Remember, think about it this way. First thing is never ask a question you don't have a preliminary answer to. I tell everybody that. Don't do that. Why? If you ask me a question that you don't have a preliminary answer to, you have to accept everything I say because you don't know what an answer sounds like. You don't have a right to say I'm right or wrong. Right. Just shut up and take notes. I don't want that. We're not looking for acolytes. We're looking for conversation partners, interlocutors, right? So that's why I kept throwing those back at you. You need to tell me what intuitively or through some reasoned process your answers would look like. Then we can engage in a conversation, right? So if you believe the guy is going to be forgiven, that's cool. I would say I would love for him to have been executed by the state. I hate people who commit suicide after they kill people. Yeah, but that's a different conversation. But my point is, I can't speak for your particular theological doctrine and dogma, is what I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to speak generally about when you talk, realize what you're saying, be critical and analytical about the types of things you're saying, understand faith statements, may share some things with evidence, with factual statements. They may even share evidence from time to time. But to assume that they assert the same thing is problematic at best. So for you to say there is a God is different from saying there is a chair that I'm sitting in. Doesn't delegitimize the claim, it's just different. And the reason why it's different, one of the reasons why it's different is because the type of evidence you're going to use to say what you're saying is different. So we've conflated the notion, we think difference means what? Deficiency. And it doesn't.
I have a question. Considering the group and the time, and considering that every Sunday in most Christian pulpits there are practical theologians, how should they take into account what the teacher in order to strengthen their evangelizing logical way that respects everybody's intelligence and everybody's growing in evolving?
I would say the position would be one of humility. So that's why I said Zoran Kierkegaard is my favorite Christian. The Sickness Unto Death is a book you should become very familiar with. And I'm going to interpolate one of his statements, which is the person who asserts knowledge is in a worse faith position than the one who claims ignorance. Right? And so what what I would suggest to a minister is make sure your congregation knows, stay humble with respect to things you think you can assert with certainty. Certainty is not always going to be the outcome of an assertion. Sometimes the outcome of an assertion is care. Right? And so the difficulty is people want to hear something they can latch on to. But makes sense though. People suffer through the week. I understand that. People suffer every day, every second of every day. You want something you can hold on to. But what we have to do is start nurturing something else to hold on to other than I know for certain. And then reinvest in the very notion of faith. That some mornings I wake up and I have no reason to believe that there's a God. Because if I do have faith, I get myself back straight later on in the day. Most people are absolutely petrified that they won't be able to get back.
Keep back up.
They cannot get back. They're absolutely afraid because they know it takes just one thing to occur in their lives and they're done. Because they've had a very flaccid, very weak relationship and faith. It's been extremely weak, right? Where they're literally teetering on, what are y'all, the language y'all use now, on their, not blessing, what y'all call them now? Their breakthroughs and all this kind of stuff now, right? So they suffer every day. You don't give them anything to deal with suffering because the thing is this, based on a very clear notion, Matthew's father does a good job of this. The issue is, stop assuming you get over tragedy.
Wow,
stop assuming you get over it. Y'all gotta, I'm telling you, Matthew's book, the beauty of it is to take away these very childish, naive notions of what it means to suffer. The idea that, well, I done prayed, I done fasted, and now I'm better. No, you are not. No, you are not. You're just as ill. The point is you have something else to hold on to. Right? So you got to stop these very immature relationships. So you tell, again, your congregation, if you've suffered, we want to represent the legitimacy of your suffering. Which means that you are a victim. When people say they're not victims, I understand the tendency. The tendency is to put people who've suffered in a position where they can take control of their lives again. But you have been victimized, though. You absolutely have been victimized. You've been traumatized. Someone did something to you that they had no right to do. Right? And what I want to tell you is, you have a right to be upset. You even have a right to ask God to kill them. You have a right. The issue is getting back from that. You can't get to love unless you understand what it means to hate. You gotta hate first. Wow. If somebody rapes you, you gotta be in a position where I hate them. Because these are extremes, hate and love. How dare you claim to love somebody, you don't know what it means to hate them? What would it mean? That means you have a lack of profundity. Think about this, when we've been in a relationship, I know what it meant not to know her, but to know her, I know that too.
Now, this is an important thing that you have said.
want you to leave here with an understanding. I want this just to be entertainment tonight. It's been very impressive. But the last point that he just made, I think the only way I can say this is kind of personal. He has just illustrated the difference between what happened to Jeremiah Wright in front of the whole nation, in front of the National Press Club, when at the zenith of his career, near retirement, he got the biggest microphone ever. And he got a meltdown. He was not his best self. He was not his best self because he was full of fear, in fact, rage. And it was a rage born from an experience that many black men in this country have had, including myself. I did not get to the microphone of the National Press Club. Lawrence Carter did not get there. But as I watched him, I thought to myself, I can really empathize with him. Because I went the same way he went when he was experiencing the American version of apartheid. But I, at that time, that he was at the National Press Club, I wasn't as full of rage as he was. Now, I will say to Professor Illya Davis, I definitely had it. I had it.
We're waiting for it.
I could break some necks. There are few black men.
That's right.
We went through what we went through. There are few who can't say that. But you know, eventually you come to understand either you will control that rage or it will master you. And unless you master it, you won't be ready for the National Press Club microphone. This is what I want you to hear. One day, you will have to be Rosa Parks. One day, the CNN microphone will swing to you, and you must be ready, or you will miss why the universe has kept you. But that's worrying on theology.
No, you all can do it. I mean, God didn't want people to leave here with a bad sense. I mean, my point about you have to hate, it's not a matter of you actually hating. The issue here is you must understand what the compunction is to lead one to hate. The same way that you have aspirations of loving, you must realize in the same instance, at that same moment, the opposite could happen. People have a naive idea that I'm just going to love, 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 and never reach. No, you will have experiences. The value of love is that it somehow supersedes that compunction. It intervenes at the point where it can be destructive, it can overwhelm you. So love is fundamentally going to be the direction you want to go in. You just have to be honest with yourself. Think about this. Jay-Z just got dumped on about wearing a symbol that's supposed to represent the 5% Nation of Islam, right? And that various media outlets are criticizing him by saying that the symbol represents hate. Well, outside of the fact that it represents a lack of historical consciousness on the part of the person who writes this, that the United States of America's flag itself represents hate for black people. But for some odd reason, they think that it somehow doesn't. And so my issue fundamentally was, how is it that you now criticize him for the possibility of representing hate when you have been of the class that's fundamentally oppressed him and people like him? So now you're trying to determine the grounds and the terms of his engagement with an oppressive structure. It's like women. Men have a tendency to want to say, well, she's being sexist. No. She was responding to our oppression of them. And so any way she decides to do it, I have little or no right to step into her suffering and tell her how to represent it. That's absolutely absurd. And racially, this has happened traditionally. That non-blacks would want to step in and tell black people that represents hate. Really? Might it represent a response to being in pain? Might it represent a response to trauma? I mean, what do you think that looks like?
Can you tell them about what happened last night? I think it's an illustration that fits here. Eric Holder, the Attorney General, in his testimony before the Senate, was attacked verbally by a Republican white male politician. And basically treated him like he was being Obama, very disrespectful on the voting contempt, and telling him that he behaved like the contempt charge was inadequate. Holder stepped out of the character that the nation had seen him in, and he became a black man. I mean, it was something. It was like he said, "Now wait a minute, I've had enough." And he spoke for Barack Obama and how he has been the recipient of abuses that no other of the 43 presidents have had to deal with, and that he as Attorney General is having the same experience. And when that finished, the commentator said, well, all black people knew who were watching. Finally, they have felled the cat. It's racism, white racism, and they don't like the fact that two black men are running the nation. Two.
Not John and Rob. I'm kidding.